Welcome to the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church Forum. The forum's mission is to afford a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those which involve ethical values in the contemporary world, and to promote critical thinking. And we've been doing this since 1943. And now please silence your cell phones. Because this is being recorded for KKFI, community radio. This morning, we're pleased to have my good friend and attorney, Bob I. He has worked for many years on a number of environmental issues, including nuclear waste, nuclear power, power plants, and a number of things for the Sierra Club in Kansas, protecting wildlife habitat. But also for the last 10 or 12 years, he's been central in Kansas to protecting reproductive rights for women. And he was part of the legal team that led to the 2019 ruling in the Kansas Supreme Court affirming that women in Kansas have the right to abortions. So he's been right in the middle of this, and so he's the ideal. This is actually the second part of a two-part series on this, and he's going to talk about the ongoing legal struggle over abortion. Bob?
Thanks much, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here as always. I guess I'm almost a frequent flyer here at the forum. I need to check my mileage to see if I have any collateral benefits. There is so much happening in the abortion rights space these days that it's pretty difficult to keep track of it. And this is all courtesy, of course, of the United States Supreme Court's decision to roll back abortion rights. And instead of making them a national issue, as Roe and its subsequent case progeny, Casey and Whole Women's Health did, it is now fractionalized into a free-for-all food fight over the course of 50 states. Some states are obviously much more active than others, but I would venture to say that there is no state in the union that is untouched by this, primarily because there's no state in the union where there are not opposing forces over the issue of abortion. Before I get started, I do want to thank Craig and the UU Forum for having me here. I can't tell you how impressed I am with the commitment of All Souls to not only do this, but to perpetuate it over time. This is not an easy chore. And I feel a little bit like a relay runner, and I've just grabbed the baton and I'm going to head for the next runner and hand it off, which is a little bit how I've characterized my law practice. I've been a lawyer for going on 43 years, which is most of my life. And I've been extremely lucky. I have gotten to do the kind of work that I always dreamed I would get to do as a lawyer. And some of that is by very conscious choice. Some of it is walking away from the financial benefits of working for, I would like to say, the dark side. But there is a certain satisfaction in knowing that you've taken the road that not just you could have taken, but that you did. And I've been very lucky to be in the right place at the right time, to get to work on cases that were at the forefront. Once in a while, I have wondered what in the world I have done. When, for example, when I was representing Planned Parenthood, in the only criminal case that was ever filed against Planned Parenthood anywhere in the United States was in Johnson County, Kansas, by former Attorney General Phil Klein, who then became the DA, and the only criminal case that Planned Parenthood's ever had to deal with. I was representing them, and when you get a call from the Johnson County sheriff before a hearing, and he says, "We need to meet at a remote place so we can secret you into the courthouse." And I said, "I'm not doing that. This is a public matter. I'm not going to be going into the courthouse like a chicken thief." And he said, "We have a specific threat that we're dealing with." So when you hear that and they're putting the flak jacket on you to go into the courthouse, you realize that this isn't just a shoving match, and that there is a great deal on the line. I represented George Tiller at one time. All George wanted to do was, quote, "practice medicine," end quote, and help women. And that's all he ever wanted to do. Getting him to sit down to get ready to go to court was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do as a lawyer, because he was doing this constantly because he had patients waiting. That's where his priority was. As Craig mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be on the team of lawyers that represented Drs. Hodes and Nauser from Overland Park in 2019, when we challenged the statute that said second-term abortions could not be performed using the most commonly used method, the D&C method. When that legislation was passed, we went into a cooperative agreement with the Center for Reproductive Rights from Washington, D.C., as we had in other cases. In this particular time, the phone call began our relationship and work on the case, and the prevailing notion at that time, when Roe and Casey were still good law, was that, well, we'd just go into federal court. We'd find that this was an undue burden on abortion, and a federal court would strike it down, and we'd be done with that, and on we go. And I said, yes, true, but we should bring this in state court. Very long, silent pause on the other end of the line, followed by, why in the hell would we do that? You're in Kansas. This isn't Massachusetts. This isn't California. This isn't even New York. Why would we possibly go into a state court in the state of Kansas to get this rolled back? And I said, well, the long game is to have a backstop against Roe going down. Then my argument began to get a little more traction. Because while the case in the Kansas Supreme Court was decided in 2019, we actually brought it in 2017. As the legislation was passed in 2016, and we brought it soon thereafter. Or, I'm sorry, it was passed in 2017, and we brought the case in 2017 after the legislation. So the prospect of Roe going down in 2017 was kind of distant. I mean, we still had a good, strong pro-Roe majority on the court, and it was a little hard to see that, it wouldn't ever be that way. But as my late mother used to say, it's the long road that has no turns. And I could see where there was the possibility of, at some point, a case coming before the United States Supreme Court, which would give the court an opportunity to strike Roe down. And so, after a number of phone calls, some of which were characterized by some tense exchanges, my colleagues agreed that we should bring this case to state court. Gulp. I thought, oh, God. Oh, they agreed. Oh, geez. I wasn't really counting on you agreeing with me. So we went into state court. We went into Shawnee County District Court, which is the place where these cases are brought originally to challenge legislation in the state of Kansas. We got a great decision out of the district judge. Judge Hendricks absolutely tracked with us right down the line and wrote a good order that went up to the Kansas Court of Appeals. There, it was very interesting because the Kansas Court of Appeals usually meets in 3-judge panels because the whole court consists of, I think there's 14 or 15 judges, but they break them up in 3-judge panels. This case, they heard en banc. All the judges participated. So you had this array of judges, all of whom were well prepared, all of whom who wanted to participate. And when it was all said and done, we had a tie. A tie. So the Kansas Supreme Court took it up to break the tie and decide what was going to happen. And I thought, this is good. This is where we want this case to be. Because we're really the beneficiary of some political events in the not too distant past that yielded appointments to the Kansas Supreme Court that were characterized by moderate Republican, moderate Democrats. Sebelius and Graves, Governor Sebelius, those consecutive terms put most of the people on the court who are there now. The only exception was Governor Brownback appointed Justice Stegall. And when the Hodes and Nauser case reached the court for oral argument, by that time that oral argument was over, because it was an extraordinarily long argument. Generally, from the Supreme Court, you get 20 minutes. We were there for a couple hours. But when it was all done, I walked out and thought, oh no, I know this is a mistake to try to predict what a court's going to do based on oral arguments. But man, this was pretty good. Some months later, court's decision came down in April of 2019, and sure enough, 6-1, we had won. And the court had found that there was an implied right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution. The dissenter was Justice Stegall, and it was clear that he wasn't going to go along with just based on oral argument. But to get a 6-1 decision, I've said the next best thing was 7-0. And it did send a shockwave through the anti-choice community. This is something they really could not conceive happening. Even with a relatively progressive Supreme Court, they could not accept that this could possibly happen. So we know what happened next. They went back into the legislature, the anti-choice faction, went back into the legislature, and the leadership, which is totally, on the Republican side, is totally anti-choice, completely committed to anti-choice. They'll go along, the leadership on the Republican side in the legislature will go along with pretty much anything the anti-choice people want. So what do they want next? We have to deal with the Hodes case, they would say. The Hodes case, which established a Kansas constitutional right to abortion. We've got to deal with it. Well, how do you deal with it? The only way to deal with it is to repeal it and replace it with a constitutional provision that says there's no right to abortion. Kansas legislature, led by the Republicans, gleefully did so. Passed it. The language in it, and you've all probably read it, the language in it was almost incomprehensible. But what did come through, loudly and clearly, was that if it passed, there would be a ban, a total ban, a complete ban on abortion in the state of Kansas. Now that wasn't a stretch whatsoever. And although the language of the proposed amendment only said that there would be a possibility of this happening, nobody was kidding themselves, and voters in Kansas were not deluded into thinking, oh, well, the legislature wouldn't actually pass a ban on abortion, even if given the opportunity and given the legal basis to do so. Why, they'd never go that far. Hogwash. 60% of voters that day, or 59% and change, said, no, we're not going to amend the Constitution because do we really think for a moment that the Kansas legislature would let Missouri and Oklahoma and other states outdo them on anti-abortion? Of course not. Kansas is the recognized national leader in the anti-abortion community. Kansas is recognized as the leader. Now that you have this contrast where you've got abortion rights being protected, it creates a real tension. So part of what I'd like to do today is just discuss where we think this all might be headed. According to the Guttmacher Institute, let me get my numbers so that they're accurate. According to the Guttmacher Institute, 58% of women in the United States between the ages of 13 and 44, make sure, here we go. 58% of women in the United States between the ages of 13 and 44 live in states that are either hostile or very hostile to abortion rights. Let me repeat that. 58% of women in the United States between the ages of 13 and 44 live in states that are hostile or very hostile to abortion rights. What's the scorecard today on abortion rights? And by the way, today, it might be different than it was yesterday, and it might be different than it is tomorrow, because you do have this 50-state race to trying to figure out where abortion rights are going to land. There are bans in a number of states. There are also bans that are being blocked in a number of states. The states where there are currently bans, and this was current as of September 26th or 7th, I think is when I figured this out. There are bans today in Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. There are blocks on those bans, temporary blocks on those bans, in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and I want to go back to Wyoming in just a second and talk about this, Utah, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Idaho. There is a 6-week ban in Georgia that is being challenged, but currently, if a woman knows she's pregnant within 6 weeks, she can get an abortion in Georgia. Now, having represented an abortion clinic for a number of years, the likelihood that women know that they're pregnant with a degree of certainty to the point where they want to take action on it within 6 weeks, my understanding is pretty low probability. It's not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's pretty low probability. There is a 15 and 18 and 20 week restriction in Florida, Utah, North Carolina, respectively. Florida has 15, I believe this is right, Utah 18, and North Carolina 20 weeks from last menstrual period. Michigan is going to have on its ballot in November an abortion rights amendment to their constitution, where they will explicitly say, not an implied right, but an explicit right to abortion. That's in Michigan. And the commentary, I went back and looked at some commentary from Michigan newspapers recently about this. It's remarkably like the commentary was in Kansas before the August 2nd election. It's remarkably the same. It goes like this. Michigan's a conservative place. Most conservatives don't like abortion. Most conservatives vote more frequently than others. Ergo, the prediction is that amendment will fail in Michigan. The no vote, opposed to abortion rights, will prevail. I think it's probably going to turn out to be a lot like Kansas. Why? Well, I have a couple of theories about this. One is that the behavior of people who have never had a right and they're told, well, you're not going to have, you didn't have that right today, you didn't have it yesterday, and you're not going to have it tomorrow. If it's never a right that's enjoyed and used by people, there's a different reaction than when a right has been enjoyed and used and it's ripped away. Think of alcohol prohibition. It's one of the few instances in the United States history where there was a well-exercised right inculcated in the society and culture that a small percentage of people, the temperance movement, irrespective of whether their intentions were good or ill, their intention was to restrict the use and possession of alcohol. We all know how that worked out, or how poorly it worked out. And the idea in the 20s that you could rid social problems from the United States by restricting alcohol was not believed by very many people. It was a minority view. The temperance movement was never a majority view in the United States, just like the anti-abortion position. It's never been a majority view in the United States. It just seems like it is. It just, because it's the nature of the issue and the profile of those who advance it, tend to make it look, the anti-abortion movement, look much bigger than it actually is. And we have now some objective evidence to support that. The vote in Kansas on August 2nd, I think, pretty much removed any doubt about where Kansas is at. And you know, I make jokes. I feel like I'm sort of privileged to do so, having been born and raised in Kansas and lived here all my life, or lived in Kansas all my life. Kansas is an extremely conservative place. In fact, before the August 2nd vote, I had an occasion to go to a high school reunion in Goodland, which is where I went to high school. Goodland, as you probably know, I-70, up in the far northwest corner of the state, 15 miles from the Colorado line, about 35, 40 miles from the Nebraska line. It's a long ways from most places. Went to a high school reunion out there, and of course I was really interested because it was about a month before the vote. I was interested in the yard signs. So I drove around not only Goodland, but in several other communities out in northwest Kansas. Wow. Having done that, it was kind of a sobering experience in terms of the prospects of the vote. Because for every one sign that I would see that was protecting abortion rights or wanted to protect abortion rights, I'd see 100 or maybe more on the other side. At my high school reunion, which in Goodland, it's a small enough high school, they have all years, every 5 years, it's an all-school reunion. So I'm standing there, and a woman came up to me who I didn't really recognize, and she happened to be in my older sister's class. And she said, "Your sister says I'm supposed to talk to you." I thought, oh, God. Now what? You know? And she said, "I live in a neighborhood in Wichita where there is not a single yard sign that is opposed to the proposed constitutional amendment." She said, "I'm opposed to it, but I am afraid to put up a yard sign." I said, "Yeah, I understand that, and that's not an irrational fear. But there are more of us than them. Remember that. In your neighborhood, that may not be the case, but it is throughout the state, and it is throughout the nation." And I would hasten to add, it's that way around the world. You know, last week, the Indian Supreme Court ruled that women have a constitutional right in India to an abortion up through the 24th week of pregnancy. India. How about Argentina, Mexico, Ireland? These places all recognize abortion rights now. Poland does not. Poland's gone the other way. Iran is hostile to abortion rights, although even they are now beginning to recognize the necessity of recognizing abortion rights. So, I hasten to add that many times in our country, politicizing an issue is looked down upon, is seen as somehow sullying a particular issue. Oh, it's made political. You know, before I went to law school, I taught political science at Bethany College in Lynchburg, and I was a graduate teaching assistant at K-State before that. And I would approach the introductory political science classes by asking people what they think politics. What is politics? What does it mean? What's it come down to? Because people say, oh, it's been politicized. Oh, it's just the politics of this and politics of that. I said, remember, the British political scientist Harold Lasswell, back in the 19th century, defined politics as who gets what. Who gets what? Now, there are scarce resources all over the place, including civil rights, by the way, is a scarce resource. So who gets civil rights? Who gets their rights recognized, and who doesn't? Well, there's the history of the United States now, isn't it? Because there's been a constant struggle to expand rights, whether it's voting rights, abortion rights. It's been a constant struggle to expand it. Has it been an even progression? Of course not. Frequently it's been step forward, 3/4 a step back, or more. So the reality for the future of abortion rights, I think it's tied very much to this continuing recognition that women's place in our society and our economy is tied to reproductive rights. Something that activists 100 years ago, Margaret Sanger and others, explicitly recognized and argued in favor of, much to their detriment frequently. So, was it a surprise on August 2nd when 59% and change came to the polls in Kansas and said no to the constitutional amendment? It was sure a surprise to the anti-choice people in Kansas. To this day, they're still in kind of a state of denial. I had a conversation with the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas lobbyists recently. I said, so what's the mood around the State House around abortion? He said, the anti-abortion people thought they won. So their attitude is absolutely just as resolute as it's always been. And they have the leadership in their hands. So don't expect a sudden enlightenment, consciousness raising amongst the leadership in the Kansas legislature, because it's not going to be there. Not this group. This leadership will be as firmly opposed to reproductive rights now as they were before August 2nd. So much for let the people speak and we will follow. That is not the chemistry when it comes to abortion. Not in Kansas at any rate. So was it a surprise? I'm going to give you 3 examples that should tell us that politicizing abortion is good for abortion rights. In fact, I would suggest essential to abortion rights. In 2011, in Mississippi, they put a heartbeat bill on the ballot, or heartbeat constitutional measure on the ballot, that said if a heartbeat could be detected, no abortion. That was on the ballot in Mississippi. In Mississippi, it didn't even come close. It was beaten by 10%, 55-45. Not even close. And by the way, the proponents of that poured an enormous amount of money into it. and they couldn't get more than 45% of the vote. Fast forward 3 years to 2014, and North Dakota, pretty conservative place, probably as conservative as Kansas. Maybe it's as conservative. I'll just leave it at that. They put on a ban, a constitutional ban on abortion. They put it on their ballot. It just got knocked around viciously. The yays were 36%. The nays were 64%. 2-1. That's pretty hefty. In 2016, I believe it was, in South Dakota, they had a ban on their ballot. It went down 55-45. 2022, in South Dakota, it's back on the ballot. I have to think that the prospects for a ban are no better now than they were then, and in fact now they may actually be worse. Why? People paid attention to what happened in Kansas. They really did. I mean, I had all kinds of calls in the run-up to that election from, acquaintances and colleagues around the country, and they just said, "Oh, what are you going to do when the ban goes into effect?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know if it's going to go into effect or not." And in fact, I'm on the ACLU of Kansas board, and about 6 weeks before the election, we had a board meeting. And ACLU has just, put a lot of resources into that election. And one of the things that we did was we ran a poll. We didn't publicize it, but we did run a poll. 6 weeks before the election, 2 weeks before the Dobbs v. Jackson decision was announced, that rolled back Roe, our polling showed 54% opposed to the amendment. 54% were opposed then. Dobbs v. Jackson comes out, and all of a sudden, we're up now to about 60%. People were paying attention. The anti-choice faction counted on one thing. Nobody would pay attention to this. They counted on the idea that if the Kansas legislative leadership said, "This is a good idea," that voters would follow. Strike one. Strike two. The third thing they didn't count on is that people would pay attention to the issue. Strike three. Out. Now, they don't know they're out. It's not just in Kansas where the anti-choice people who should be on the defensive aren't. It's all around the country. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance that apparently impairs rational thinking on the anti-choice side. And I'm not really sure what to do about that. I mean, I have learned over time to not fear or, I use this term advisedly, hate my enemies. No, the idea is to understand them. Understand what makes them tick. And then you have a chance at dealing with them successfully. What makes the anti-choice faction tick, I don't know if we've actually parsed that sufficiently yet or not. There are a lot of theories about it. I won't get into them today. But I do want to mention, since 3 legal things that are happening that weigh into this abortion question. We all know about the Texas bounty scheme, where they've effectively empowered individual citizens to snitch, to rat out their neighbors on abortion for a reward. That's a bounty. We know about the discussion in Missouri about extraterritorial jurisdiction for criminal prosecutions. A woman from Missouri goes to Kansas, gets an abortion, and is charged with a crime in Missouri. This is a radical departure from the nature of state power, which generally stops at the state line unless there are other significant contacts. But in the civil rights context, usually that state power ends at the state line. But that discussion is being had not only in Missouri, but a number of other states. In Alabama, the state is jailing pregnant women who use marijuana. They're jailing them. Yeah. So there are coercive methods being used to try to affect people's attitudes about abortion. None of them will work. None of these will work. And in fact, it will add to the support for abortion rights. This is one of the mistakes that the anti-choice faction has made over time, overreaching. They overreach. Why? Because they have not yet accepted that they are simply a small minority, that they are not in the majority. In Kansas, if they're not in the majority here, where would they be in the majority? I really can't imagine. Okay, maybe in North Dakota, maybe Mississippi. Evidently not. So the long-term prospect of the anti-choice movement is a little bit like the progression of the temperance movement on alcohol. Remember, Kansas was a dry state until 1986. It took that long to get liquor by the drink in Kansas. 86. Prohibition was lifted in what? First term of Roosevelt, 34, I think is when Prohibition ended. It took Kansas 50 years to catch up. We may be like that on abortion rights as well. Some states are going to be the vanguard, protecting rights. Others are going to lag. Unless we do find that in the future there is a solid 60 votes in the United States Senate for abortion rights, national act. It'll take 60 votes, unless they roll back the filibuster rule. And you can nationalize this and take it out of the state's hands, which is really, from an abortion rights perspective, is the only safe thing to do. But we're quite a few votes shy of doing that. Watch the midterms. Many elections in the midterms will be decided by the abortion vote. That's the way it is now. Over time, the pro-choice side will prevail over time, but it may be a long time in some states. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to conclude, and if anybody has some questions, I'll do my best to respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. We'll now take up the purely voluntary collection in support of the forum. We're now going to have question and answers, and please refrain from making statements. There'll be time for that afterwards when Bob will stick around for a while for further discussion. So I'll let you select questions.
Going back in your remarks to politics, you were discussing how one of the things that is involved in that is who gets what. So as time has gone by, various groups have apparently occasionally attained more rights. Do you see the U.S. population recognizing the rights of women more and more as being an influencing factor in the pro-choice movement in general?
I do, and partly because of the historical progression to date. I mean, it's no coincidence that when the discussion around the Equal Rights Constitutional Amendment was more vigorous, that was tied to reproductive rights. And I think that when you hear about the Ledbetter Act, which was the attempt to equalize pay between men and women, a lot of that's tied back to reproductive rights. And as we have become a more urban society, less rural, more urban, I think that the recognition of the necessity of women becoming an integral part of the economy and the society, that's now second nature. But it's relatively recent, too. I mean, that change is certainly within my lifetime. And I have to think that if there can be a significant shift within the body politic in my lifetime recognizing women's rights, that reproductive rights protection and progression on it is not far behind. The other reason I say that is because the public opinion survey data seem to be very consistent that the younger a person is, the more likely they are to be protective of reproductive rights. Of course, the converse holds as well. The older seems to be less protective. But it's the younger. I mean, that's who decided the election on August 2nd in Kansas. Wasn't boomers. It was millennials, Gen Xers, Gen Zers. They showed up. And when they do show up, abortion rights are going to be protected.
Morning, sir.
Hey, George.
Along the lines of kind of a conspiratorial process, it occurs to me that there is a group of people who have been not only worried about anti-abortion, but environmental issues, as we talked about earlier. Do you see the planning group, the think tank behind a lot of this as the folks that they don't really care one way or the other, but they see it as a mechanism? Can you discuss that?
Yeah, I think that it's not a coincidence that those who would be disdainful of reproductive rights are not going to be very enthusiastic about protecting rights to a clean environment, right? I mean, the Venn diagram on that, is pretty obvious. So now it's really a matter of who's going to be in power to determine who gets what. And this gets back to fair elections, elections that are not determined by whose district a particular candidate wants to have his voters be from, as seems to be rampant throughout our country now. It's going to be dependent on not suppressing the vote, period. Because if those things if suppressing the vote is successful, if continuing to redistrict to favor politicians that are in current power, the democracy is just a democracy in name only. It's really not a functioning democracy. So a lot of this hangs in the balance. But I am optimistic, a little bit contrary to my nature. I am optimistic about the prospects of the future. Why? Because on August 2nd in Kansas, it was millennials, Gen Xers, and Gen Zers that won that election for the pro-choice side. That's why there's a reason to be somewhat optimistic.
I've heard some economists quoted as saying after 20 years after abortion became legal, the crime rate went down, and it was directly related, but you don't hear that much.
Right. Well, yeah, good point. There are a number of ripple effects since abortion was legalized. Lower crime rate, see the role of women in the economy, see average wages of women. There are all kinds of indicators that reproductive rights are key to enjoying other rights. And that if reproductive rights are not extant, I mean, let me just give you an anecdote. My stepson and his wife recently moved from Tokyo back to the United States so he could go to law school. They had 2 children when they were living in Japan. Japan's a great place to have kids. Oh. At least a year's worth of time, of paid time off, maternal, at least a year. It can be longer. At least a year. And the job is safe when you want to go back to it. All kinds of state-sponsored and supported daycare, preschool. It's really quite remarkable, the quality of which is just really out of sight. Well, they were thinking about having a 3rd kid. before they moved here. And I said, don't count on the kind of social support that you got from the government of Japan. Number one, Japan has a declining birth rate. They're really concerned about not having enough people. So they promote birth to accommodate those other needs. But even in Japan, the birth rate is level or declining still, even with those state supports. So I think that in the United States, the recognition that we will be left behind on the world stage if abortion rights are not protected, if when children are born, they don't have adequate state support to make sure that their food, clothing, and housing, medical care, education are taken care of, then we will be left behind. Once in a while people say, gee, you came from western Kansas. How did you get to be so leftish, so progressive? And I said, well, it's funny. I grew up in a socialist household. My housing, my food, clothing, education, and medical care were provided for me as a child. That's a socialist outcome. Have I realized all the potential that I came into this world with? No, I haven't. But a lot more than I would have if my food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and educational needs hadn't been fulfilled. Then I wouldn't have had any of that, any chance at what I've been able to do. So, as you can tell, I don't really have very many strong views about any of this stuff. So, somebody should probably grab the microphone from me pretty soon.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I want, we've been so divided over abortion for generations. But what hope do you have? Could be a common ground there, which we never seem to find, where in advance of reducing we could work together, conservative and liberal, toward reducing the opportunity, the situations that create the need for abortion. Is there any prospect of us coming together ever?
Good question. We have to remind ourselves that every unwanted pregnancy was caused by a man. Think about it. Every single unwanted pregnancy was caused by a man. But what we know is that male contraception is kind of in the 18th century still, whereas women's contraception is, pretty advanced, at least in terms of the science of it. So do I see some common ground that might move the needle a bit more to the pro-choice side? I do, because there are too many instances. There are too many sisters who can look at another sister and say, oh my God, the reason she's poor is because she had a child before she was able to support it. There are too many friends who can look at friends and see a similar circumstance. Those are learning opportunities. Those are shaping opportunities, shaping attitudes. And this is where the politics of it don't make much difference. That personal effect, that personal influence will override the most eloquent politician on either side. And so it's that common experience. About 30% of women in the United States will have an abortion before the age of 45. 30%. Now that means that woman's going to have relationships with sisters and brothers, with children, who are going to have their own views shaped by the fact that this woman over here got an abortion. So I do think that there's some reason for optimism, if only because the society itself has accepted the role of abortion. Not all society, but not all society approves having a drink of alcohol. There's still the temperance society out there. And that is a part of pluralism. I mean, we're a pluralist society. We're never going to eradicate some views. It's just not going to happen. It's a matter of accommodating, understanding, and then working so that those views don't become the majority position. And that's a real challenge, because I can tell you I've spent a lot of time thinking about how could you go to an anti-choice person and convince them to be not anti-choice. I invite your ideas. Thank you.
I have a question. It's about the Texas bounty law, which, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, it means that someone in Texas can rat on somebody out of Texas and get up to $10,000 in a judgment. Now, you said that isn't going to work, but I'd be interested in how that's going to play out in the courts. Isn't that going to end up in federal court?
It very well, it might. Although now with the ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson, I'm not so sure that the court wouldn't just defer to the Texas statutory scheme. And the reason that it works in Texas is because that's a civil scheme that they're dealing with. People would get a judgment in civil court for their $10,000. By the way, it would be against the woman or the provider who did the abortion. That's who they're supposedly going to get the $10,000 from. It's baloney. It's malarkey. Nobody's going to get that money. I would be very surprised if anybody ever sees a dime of it, because it is going to get hung up in court. And eventually there's going to be a political reaction to that. I mean, there's already a strong faction in Texas that's pro-choice. They're not quite the majority yet, but they're moving toward it, and they will be in the majority soon. Contrast that civil scheme with Missouri, who wants to criminalize in Missouri getting an abortion in Kansas or some other state. Criminal penalty, I mean, I practiced criminal defense law for decades. That sent a chill through my lawyer bones, because that's one thing that we would always be able to advise clients on, generally in criminal matters. You know, if you've committed a crime in New Jersey, you're not going to get prosecuted in New York. How do we know that? When Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, it was in New Jersey. Burr went back home to New York and was prosecuted for it. Raised the defense of jurisdiction. Aaron Burr was acquitted. It's an example where states can't exercise criminal jurisdiction over conduct that's happened in another state. Now Missouri and other states want to flip that and allow extension of state criminal jurisdiction beyond its own borders. You want to talk about unraveling a system that has developed pretty steadily over the last couple of hundred years. That would do it. It distorts the nature of state power. It betrays the idea that states have a degree of sovereignty when Missouri can interfere with what goes on in Kansas on an abortion, for instance. And I think that it's a tough sell. But, you know, somebody asked Stalin one time, as he was going through one of his purges and denying people's rights, they said, "Comrade, how can you possibly deny people rights that they've enjoyed all these years?" And he said, "It's like a salami, one thin slice at a time." Pretty soon the salami is gone. Well, this is kind of the anti-choice playbook. One restriction after another, after another, after another, make abortion so burdensome that people won't pursue it. The pro-choice side is just as committed, just as active to prevent that from happening. So we have playing out on the national stage, and even on the international stage, this colossal conflict between attitudes. And if majority rule means anything, then pro-choice, then reproductive rights are going to be protected. If majority rule means anything. If majority rule means anything. And I'm not sure that it has the same heft that it has in the past. That's a whole other story, and maybe you can be invited back sometime to discuss that too.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. That was
Thank
really
you.
great.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now, anyone who would like to go to hear the service, this is the time. But we're going to stick around for a while and have further discussion. I also want to mention that next week's speaker will be Dr. Jennifer Collier, who will speak on what's next for the Kansas City Public Schools. So that should be really interesting.
I think that's the most familiar story. You guys did it just a couple minutes. It's rarely negative. Are you looking to drop that off for HOD?
And actually, you know, the little key is down the would be no children. Oh, no, seriously, to go through all of that.
And typically, the stop screening buttons, whatever issues they have today, with that, and they'll go and stop that. And I was talking to Mika, once she solidifies everything, she'll probably do a training with you and George when he's interested, so you guys both know these little things.